everybody. Welcome back to the Cosmic Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Adelina East. I am an EMDR therapist. I use internal family systems or parts work therapy. And I also use my own modality called transformational healing, blending neuroscience and spirituality to lead people towards healing themselves. This is something I believe we are all capable of. If you need the right guide, you are ready. I'm so excited to be back with you today. We have an incredibly awesome special guest. For those of you who've been listening to this podcast for years and years, you know all about my mold story. We won't get too deep into that today, but we do have an expert with us, and I'm so grateful that she's here. Thank you so much for being here, Katie. Today, we have Katie Driessens, who's been a registered dietitian for almost 14 years. She started in outpatient, Western medicine-focused care and massively shifted to outpatient integrative holistic care. She had years of her own health problems being dismissed in the conventional sick care system. And underlying mold toxicity has been a driving force in Katie's personal life and professional life that has led her to become a mold illness CIRS or CIRS literate practitioner. She's passionate about helping people find and heal from root causes, which are often present when we dive deeper. Katie is a unicorn and actually accepts insurance, everybody. She accepts insurance and she does telehealth appointments for adults. Thank you so much for being with us today, Katie.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's dive right in. Can you first tell us what CIRS is an acronym for?
That's a really good question. So CIRS stands for Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. And I think since I filled out that bio, I actually became a Dr. Shoemaker proficiency partner for CIRS.
Oh, yay. Congratulations.
Thank you. And so it is a multi-symptom, multi-system, that's what I'm looking for, multi-symptom, gosh, that is such a tongue twister. Illness that's not a condition, illness. So it's something that we can heal from that happens as a result of chronic mold exposure, especially when a person has specific haplotypes or genetics. Mm-hmm. And it's estimated that there's millions of us walking around undiagnosed from biotoxins that we are exposed to. Now, today we're going to talk about mold, right? There are, of course, other endotoxins and things that can lead to CIRS. But yeah, CIRS is probably one of my favorite things to talk about.
I have to say, it kind of is mine too. And the reason is that, just to get everyone, if you're new to this podcast, on this podcast, we basically just talk about different ways to heal from stuff. That's what this podcast is all about. So if you've been let down by what Katie refers to as the sick care health system, I have too. I hear you. I feel you. My story is that it all just kind of came to a crescendo. There was, 2 years spent in a wheelchair. No one could really figure out what was going on. Doctors were like, well, you can't feel your feet, or when you do feel them, they hurt really badly. So I'm going to guess it's MS, but you're missing all of these other markers. Some days you can get from the chair to the bathroom alone. Some days you can't move at all and you're just stuck in bed and literally can't move a muscle. I don't know. So after really 2 years of intense trauma trying to figure out what was going on, I was finally diagnosed with CIRS. And realized in certain environments, I felt better. In certain environments, I felt worse. And I had to just stay completely out of mold to try to heal myself. That then led to moving constantly and changing my work environment and all these different things. I'm 8 years in now, and I am finally in what I think is a mold-free house, but I do anxiety call the mold inspector probably every 6 months, every time, something really small and minute happens, and we test again and there's still no mold, but it is a deep emotional trauma as well for me, because I just don't ever want to end up in that situation again where I can't feel my body, or when I do feel my body, I'm in such incredibly intense pain. The other thing I think people don't talk about is the way that when you are exposed to mold or other endotoxins, right? Lyme disease, pesticides, all of these other things, it can cause permanent damage in your body. And so, though we can heal certain parts of it, there are certain parts that won't heal. If you're comfortable sharing, Katie, I would love for you to share your story with our audience because I think it's so inspiring.
Oh, well, sure. I'm honored to open up about it. And I am an open book about this because, kind of like you and your mission, I don't ever want anyone to go through the depths of hell that we went through. And the sooner that we can find it and deal with it, the better the outcome typically. So my story is, a very personal one, but I share it like you said, because I want to help as many people as possible. So I'll try to not go on forever about this because there's a lot of detail, but the short and sweet of it is several years ago, we moved into a house, and I always shout this from the rooftops because now I know hindsight's 2020. Home inspections are not mold inspections. And so people always say, well, it would have been on your home inspection. Bullshit. Most home inspectors are not certified mold inspectors. We got a house, we moved in. For a while, we were fine. And that's common in people that eventually end up being diagnosed with CIRS, that it's usually months before debilitating symptoms start to occur. And so for me, it was, this might be a little TMI, but recurring vaginal yeast infections every single month. I had over 30 of them. I gained 25 pounds. I don't mean to make this sound cocky, but I was a marathon running dietitian. And it just didn't make sense why I was gaining weight so rapidly, being someone who is into exercising and eats relatively healthy. As I sit here drinking my caramel macchiato, I always preach moderation. But for the most part, I was eating pretty well. Headaches, fatigue, intense bloating. I looked pregnant. Oh gosh, there are so many symptoms, but that's kind of me in a nutshell. My daughter eventually started to develop bloody noses and mouth breathing. She ended up being diagnosed with hypertrophic adenoids and moderate sleep apnea and ended up having her adenoids removed. My husband, not as much we knew of initially, but now there's a lot coming out. He has EOE, gut issues, fatigue was a big one. And then my son was the canary in the mine, and he was having respiratory distress. And that was the biggest thing that really drove us to trying to figure out what is going on here. As a clinician, I was a clinician back then when we moved into the house. I wasn't near as mold literate or CIRS literate as I am today, many years later. But I had a hunch from the beginning. Okay, this is mold. And I know mold shows up differently in different people, right? Because that's another common misconception. People are like, well, don't we all have a cough? Depends on the body's own constitution, genetics, of exposure, other comorbidities. I mean, there's so many things that dictate how mold shows up in a person, and maybe not the same in all family members, even though you're all in the same house. And so we got a mold inspector out. He showed up with a flashlight. I'm in Illinois now. As of this week, you have to be certified in Illinois and be a mold inspector. But years ago, you didn't. Anyone can call themselves a mold inspector. I didn't know that. He shows up with a flashlight, looks around my house. He's like, you're good. I took that as he's an expert in his field. We're fine. And fast forwards, my son continues to have respiratory distress. We're in and out of the ER 1 to 2 times a month with labels of asthma, reactive airway disorder. My son eventually is seeing, no, not 9, 8 different doctors for all sorts of bodily issues, because it wasn't just respiratory distress. It was also relentless diarrhea. He also had a sleep study and was diagnosed with sleep apnea. Eczema, that he was scratching so hard, he was causing infections in his skin that we had to do antibiotics for. I mean, poor little baby, he was only at 1 when we moved into the house, but this is, a toddler. Through all of this. Eventually, I don't know if it was a year later, we had another inspector out, and they did what I call, and I'm sorry I talk so candidly, but I call it the bullshit tripod in the middle of the room test, where they did an air sample and it came back nothing, everything is fine. And eventually my son went into respiratory failure and was in the ICU. It was really hard. I'm not going to lie. It was really hard to watch. And a doctor in the hospital, when we were getting ready to be discharged after he was stable, looked at me and he's like, have you checked the house for mold? And I was like, yes, twice.
Yeah.
I'm a clinician. I was thinking that. And he's like, and look again. I came home. I took a sledgehammer to a wall in a fit of rage. And
Wow, Katie.
I was right. There was black all behind. And
Oh,
and I called another company and he came out and very nice guy. And he's actually who I send a lot of people to this day if they're local to me. I have no financial relationship with him, but his name's Jim Blandy and he's with Green Home Solutions in the Chicagoland area. And he came out and he spent 3 hours with me. Obviously, it was obvious to what I'd open up, but he found it in the attic. It was behind that wall from a leak and it was all over my crawl space. And he was like, I don't know
oh.
how they missed this. Like, maybe behind the wall, but like it's everywhere. So a good
Hmm.
inspector, right, will do thermography, look at humidity, spend a lot more time visually looking into it, air sampling, ERMI. There's pros and cons of all different types of tests that I talk a lot about in my blogs, but he did a nice thorough overview. And
Yeah.
long story short, we were eventually able to get remediation done. The project had to be staggered over time because we couldn't fix the wall until we fixed the roof because the roof was leaking and there was just so many big pieces, but we could start at least our remediation journey. My
Okay.
son, the sickest, went to the healthiest, probably the most quickly. He was off of all of his medications within a month, like steroids,
Wow.
inhalers. Um, what else was he on? The diarrhea really slowed down. I mean,
He was
perked up.
tiny, right?
He was,
Yeah.
yeah, could have only been 20 or 30 pounds at the time.
Aw.
Yeah, so he got leaps and bounds better quickly. I eventually got a CIRS diagnosis myself because I started to take my own body more seriously and not like, oh, because all the doctors just kept saying, you're so sick and stressed because he's obviously sick and in and out of specialists and hospitals all the time. You're just, the sick, tired mom. And I really advocate for women's health that don't take that dismissive and reductive answer, like test and don't
Right.
guess and figure out what's going on. Because I was only in my early 30s, right? Like this doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I feel so the way I did. But anyways, that was kind of, I mean, that's the short and sweet of the story that we were let down by doctors. We were let down by multiple mold inspectors, and it took relentless advocacy on my part to figure this out. And
Yeah.
that's really what I see in my patients all the time. I'm everything's normal, everything's fine. It's all in your head. You just need to drink more water, all the
Yeah.
very statement treatments that people are told. And so I eventually decided I'm going to learn everything I can about CIRS and mold. Well, I already had a practice at the time, but I really took my practice in the direction of, and what I say on my own podcast a lot, test and don't guess. I am very
Right.
test, don't guess focused, give the body what it needs, take out what it doesn't. And a lot of times, not everything, because I do believe some conditions, you do have to access the sick care system. Some things are idiopathic, bad luck, but most
Hmm.
of our chronic health problems are due to a lack of something or an excess of something. And the silver lining in all that is you can heal, you can get better. That is kind of getting long-winded, but that is my main message and mission in helping people.
I love that message. I hope that it's true for me 8 years later. You're making me want to get my house checked again. So, what do we look for in an inspector? If we realize we're having some of these symptoms you just detailed, what are we trying to find in an inspector? How should they be testing our home? What does it look like?
That's a great question. If you're having signs and symptoms, right, or just even a hunch if mold could be in your home, and I do want to real quick circle back to how you said, like the PTSD, call the inspector. I,
Mm-hmm.
I'm like that kind of to this day too. Every now and then, I'm like, there is no harm in bringing them out. Let's just have a quick look see, especially if something is wrong. Um, and he'll graciously come out and check. So I think there's no harm when there's reason to think, like you said, if something is starting to worsen again or whatever, bring them out again and have an evaluation because could there be new water damage that's not completely off the table, right?
Right.
So back to the question of what do you look for? So I have a whole blog on this that I eventually I can send to you if you want to put that in the notes of the
For
podcast.
sure. Please do. Yes.
But I have a whole thing to walk through because I wish it was a really short and sweet answer, but I'll give you the bullet points of what to
Okay.
look for in a good mold inspector. One, that they're certified. Not all states have laws, I guess, requiring certification. So you have to go above and beyond what your state laws say. You should always look for certification.
For
If you go
sure.
to Change the Air Foundation, are you familiar with that nonprofit?
Yeah.
Change the Air Foundation, they have a really good interactive website where you can click on your state and it'll tell you what the laws are for your state or how to look into mold laws. But anyways, in Illinois, where I'm at, there's a law that was passed January 1st. You have to be certified. So that's at least good for people in Illinois. And there's a couple other states around the country that have similar laws. But if you don't have a state that has, protection for you, a really good free resource is www.acac.org/find. If you go there, you can at least filter by zip code. Okay, here's certified by me by zip code.
Okay.
Now, sometimes they're certified and they're still not that great, but at least they have the knowledge, like very basic foundational of, okay, I'm at least certified, I've taken tests to prove mastery of knowledge. From there, they should be following, I'm going to probably botch the number now that I'm live, the IICRC 520 or 529 standards.
Okay.
I'm so sorry that I'm live and I'm forgetting the number, but it's
okay.
it's a standard of these. This is how we should approach the home in terms of remediation. So if you ask them this very basic question that I put in my blog post, they should be able to speak to oh, yes, I know what that is. We do, air scrubbing. They had this list of all these things that they should be doing. So they should know what that standard is.
Okay.
They should be looking at your home, I guess three, they should be looking at your home from multiple lenses. It's not just an air sample. It's not just humidity screenings. It's not just thermography.
Mm-hmm.
They should be coming in and looking at your home from a multitude of angles because there are pros and limitations of all tests, right?
Yes.
So I know and I joke, I sometimes call this on my social media, the mold wars. And I just did a 30-minute live on this a couple days ago about people being either very pro ERMI or people being very pro air sampling. And it causes a huge debate of, oh, that's a bad test or that's so much back and forth. And I understand both sides, but at the end of the day, they both have legs to stand on and there's pros and limitations of both tests. What I tell patients is there should be something objective going on, that there's some sort of air sampling and or ERMI sampling. I could get into a whole, I don't know how far you want me to go into like the mold wars on the ERMI and the air sampling, but if you want me to go there, I will, but the short and sweet of it, there's objective testing going on. So ERMI, did you have one or both of those tests done for you?
So I lived in apartments for a long time. I was a New Yorker. And then I moved to LA. And throughout my time in New York and LA, I did ERMIs because it's an apartment. I'm not going to remediate it. If it's a high ERMI, I'm just not going to live there. Do you ever feel like you're stuck and you're not quite sure what to do next? Do you ever feel like maybe the best times of your life might be behind you and you're not sure where to go from here? I completely understand. I work with a lot of people in the same situation. If you are going through this sort of life transition time, I'm here to help. I find that with a lot of my clients, the life transition time overlaps with a lot of other things. Parents aging, raising children, switching careers, relationship changes, all of those kinds of things. I believe in the ability of all of us to transition through these things with ease and with grace if you have the right guide. I am so happy to work with you through any and all of these things. I find that a lot of trauma healing can happen during this time because we start to look at how that has impacted our lives so far. So if you're starting to notice yourself going through changes, wanting to see more change in your life, and wanting to let go of these older traumas, check out my website. We're going to include the link below. You can book just a single session with me to start if that feels right for you, either using EMDR or internal family systems or IFS therapy, also called parts work. Or you can book a transformational healing session, my own modality, to try to work through whatever's going on a spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical level all at the same time. I really recommend this. I find it's the fastest way through. But of course, this is up to you, and I have lots of different options to suit every need. I would love to walk with you through this transition time. I hope to hear from you soon. When I moved to New Mexico, I started working with this man named Dan Stye, and I don't know if you have experience of him. but he did multiple air samples. He did multiple tape lifting tests, which I'd never seen before. And he has written several books about the different ways, because he does do ERMIs, but he doesn't want to just rely on one method. So he does a lot of different things.
Yeah. And there are so many things to weigh when we talk about ERMI. And so those who are listening, if they're not familiar with what I'm talking about, ERMI is environmental relative moldiness index. Watching that, but it's basically a dust sample, right? And you're looking to see if mold is in the dust, and the higher the score, oftentimes the worse it is. As a Shoemaker proficiency partner, they view that test as a safety blanket, if you will, as if you do a repeat test before you can go back into your home. Is it low enough? Because that correlates to safety and not triggering again the CIRS response. Right. The limitations of the test is it is kind of like an air sample. It's just a snapshot in time. There is room for user error in how the test is collected. How old is that dust? It can over and under diagnose a problem. So that's where I think it's a good first screening tool. But sometimes the caveat to that is you could do it incorrectly, write it off as not a problem, and you actually do have a problem. So this is where I usually will tell my patients, or in my platform, is take it with a grain of salt. You can do it, but really at the end of the day, you need to hire a certified mold inspector, because, okay, the ERMI is going to tell you, like what you said, is this apartment safe or not, based upon how much is in the dust. If a lot's in the dust, likely it's somewhere, just don't even go there. Right. But the problem is, if you do it yourself, okay, where is it? We still don't know why. We still don't know where it's coming from. Is it a moisture issue, a ventilation issue, an unencapsulated crawl space? You still need the certified mold inspector to come out, find the source, figure out the root problems, right? Put preventative strategies in place, remediate properly, and then do clearance testing, right? To make sure the home is still safe. Because like you said, the apartment, sadly, and why sometimes people will do an ERMI if they're, touring the apartment, get the data before they sign the lease. Because sadly, with renting, you sometimes don't even want to go there, because how ethical is the landlord? Sadly, what they do when a renter reports, I think there's mold or I'm getting sick, they send their maintenance team in, which is better than nothing.
It's always terrible. They just spread it around.
Right. And they're not certified mold inspectors. And oftentimes, sadly, what they do is they paint over it.
I know.
Hello. Like, that can travel through paint. Mycotoxins can travel through walls.
And my love is when they're like, oh, we use the mold resistant paint, whatever that kills, I think it's called. It's like, oh, good. Please put more toxins in my air and don't do anything about the mold. That sounds fantastic. Yeah.
And now you just pissed off the mold, and now it's going to grow back with a vengeance. So totally agree with that. It's awful. And so this is where I actually just had on my podcast, I don't know if you know who Christina Bear is, but she's one of the top mold litigation attorneys in the country. And she is starting to fight for people who have been harmed by mold. And oftentimes it's due to negligence on the landlord and negligence on, she's taking on several dorms around the country where the students are getting very sick, and the university is doing nothing about it. So I know we live in how do I word this? A litigious country. And I'm not for, over, fighting every little thing. But when it comes to like biotoxins and it potentially killing people, because it can, it is an area where if the wrongdoer, a responsible party, is trying to cover something up or not seek safe, breathing, livable, compatible with air, that's a basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Right.
And so I'm very for all of the work and the mission that Christina is doing, because she personally was harmed and developed cancer from mold.
Sorry.
I know, isn't that awful? And so she beat it. She ended up going into practice to help other mold impacted people. And she's actually taken on the U.S. I might botch this, Navy, and won a huge settlement because of the poor living conditions for those who serve our country. And so in the armed forces. And so she's taking on really big cases around the country. So I'm kind of off on a tangent about that, but to people who are listening, if you are in a situation and your renter or your landlord is not doing anything, massive, I hate to say slap on the wrist on their part, but slap on the wrist on their part. And there are resources out there to protect you, because renters should not be exposing people that they are, they should be getting a safe living environment. Like that's so
Right.
basic, right?
It's so basic. Just to divert back to the air sample ERMI debate, the mold war. What are the limitations of air sample? It's just a snapshot. It's a small picture of time.
Yes, that is the short and sweet of it. So when they do an air sample, especially when they put it in the middle of the room, Christina will talk about this, and so will a lot of other really good mold inspectors around the country, is it's a snapshot of time. It's oftentimes only 10 minutes for an aerosol. And if the dust and mold, because a lot of molds are heavy and fall flat, right? They're not in the air, they're on the ground or they're behind the walls, it might not pick up. And so with our situation personally, it showed nothing because it was in the middle of the room. But when you do what's called cavitation sampling, or when you sample closer to the situation, or there's a newer test out now called an EMEA, where they actually agitate the dust to actually get it up into the air, then they do an hour-long air sample. It oftentimes can pull much more and give a much more reflective snapshot of what's going on.
Okay.
And so that's another option that's kind of starting to be very trendy, is the EMEA test.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
I kind of joke, it's like half ERMI, half air sampling.
Yeah.
So it'll give you a better picture, but then again, they still have to figure out the source of it, but you can at least see the thresholds. So in terms of safety, if we had to give like a short and sweet answer here, when we're talking about an ERMI test, most people, it really needs to be less than a 2. There's a whole debate on that, but
there is a whole debate on that, but yes,
it's impossible. And like most homes, you'll never get it down to 0, right? Like that's because all homes have mold. And I don't love when people say that, well, all homes have mold. The reality though is they do, but the $1 million question is it safe or not for the person? And have that gene, or you're susceptible given this HLA haplotype that I can order for patients, meaning you have a much lower threshold of what you can be exposed to. And so if we had to give a short and sweet answer, 2, 1, 0, whatever, I mean, obviously lower the better if possible.
Yeah.
Air sampling, again, this is whole mold wars that we could go off onto on this, but I usually tell patients like 3, 4, 500 or less in terms of the cubic, what is the word I'm looking for?
Isn't it cubic meter
per square foot?
Squared? Yeah.
That unit of measurement, it should really be pretty low. 0 again is unfeasible, but it should be low, like really low 100s. My son's room was 7,000.
Oh God, Katie.
My son's room was 7,000. Our crawl space was, what was the crawl space? I'd have to double check on that number. I think the attic, it was either the attic or the crawl space was 35,000. So it was, as you can imagine, okay, 500 is the threshold. And
you poor guys. Oh my God.
Day in and day out, it's a lot, right? And so that's another threshold that if you had your sampling and your landlord or mold inspector is saying, oh, this is fine, because sometimes they see millions and they're like, oh, that's bad. And they kind of dismiss or reduce something that's like 500.
Yeah.
Nope, that still can make you sick, especially if you have that genetic, that genetic profile, you really need to get aggressive remediation done for your body to be able to heal. Like with the genes and stuff, your MSH will likely never come up. Your C4A lab, which are markers of CIRS, will likely never come down. If you're constantly living in an ERMI that, for intents and purposes today, high ERMI or high air sampling, you're likely not going to get better, even if the maintenance paints over it. So you have to do proper remediation, right?
Right. And I am so grateful for our audience right now. For those of you who are not mold people, who are not keeping up with all this, the C4A and the MSH that Katie's referring to, these are markers in our blood that we've been exposed to mold. Mine are probably not great still. But I do think there is something to be said for knowing what tests to order and being able to figure out what the steps are. So one of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Katie, is that you make it available to people and they can consume as much as they want on your blogs, on your social media, but you're really clear about how, I can work with you and we can undertake strategies to make you feel better right now, but ultimately you're not really going to feel better until you get out of the mold. So let's attack that first. Let's test and don't guess the house first and see what's going on and start that process before you start anything else, because you can be, as I am, on supplements for decades and trying to resolve everything through supplementation. and still be living in a mold space.
You're correct. I use the analogy a lot. Think of your body as a bathtub. My role when you come to me, because I am oftentimes the person's first point of contact
Right.
that, oh, we're putting mold on the radar.
Yep.
I can help you drain the bathtub.
Yep.
You're blue in the face and we can keep draining the bathtub. But if the faucet is still on, it's going to be really hard, right? Because it just keeps dumping into the body. And you think if it's in your home, your apartment, 1 square inch of mold is putting off 1 million spores per day. And if you just keep breathing that in, it's going to be very hard. You're going to be doing, I say the expression, and I say this with love, downstream symptom whack-a-mole, just constantly trying to suppress the symptoms. Even if it's supplements and it's more holistic, same thing. It's just now the green version of Western medicine. And not that I'm anti-Western medicine. I think there's, time and place for sick care, and some things do need diagnosed, and some conditions we don't have another option except medication. But a lot of it is downstream symptom whack-a-mole. We're not going upstream enough to see why the body is even acting out in the first place. And I'm not a physician. I can't medically diagnose, but when people come to me, it is in the scope of practice of a dietitian to do tests that are nutrition or lifestyle related, because what I specialize in is giving the body what it needs, and we can remove barriers to health. We can talk about mold. We can talk about getting out of it, because that is a very known biotoxin. And so I don't get long-winded, but succinctly, yes, it's hard to heal the body when you're still exposed to the thing that's hurting it.
Right. And I think the reason I bring this up is that I think that I want to make sure our audience knows that you're such an ethical practitioner. I think there are practitioners out there who will be like, oh, here, I get 30% commission on every supplement I sell. Let's keep doing this for years and years. And maybe you'll never actually get out of the mold, but I'll keep making my 30% and my visits with you. So yay, I've worked with practitioners like that. So I appreciate your ethics and your honesty with people of like, let's get out of the bath first,
Yep, correct. I'm so glad, and that's very sweet of you to mention. I do try to my core to do right by my patient, and not like what you said, a lot of people do profit off of people's vulnerability, because that's what happened to us. And it's very sad, right? And so I take insurance. I have nothing to gain, right, from referring people out to mold inspectors. That's just oftentimes
doing what's right. Yeah.
It's doing what's right. Now, it's unrealistic, though, if someone truly does have CIRS, which I can do the blood tests for. I can't diagnose you, but we can monitor those biomarkers, because they do respond to diet and lifestyle interventions, assuming you're out of it. Now, if you're still in it, you're likely not going to get leaps and bounds better. Sometimes people don't have a choice, like they can't get out of their lease and they're still in it for 2 months, or whatever the situation is.
Exactly.
Start to drain the tub, but I never want to take advantage of someone and say this is going to work when it's not going to work if you're still exposed. But we can try to lessen the burden in the meantime. So I'll usually start draining the tub with someone, at least do some supportive care, help calm down their mast cells, whatever it is in terms of how the mold is showing up in their body.
Yeah.
With though, that you're correct, we do have to work to get out of it.
So can we talk about women's hormones and biotoxins for a minute?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I'm so happy. So most of our listeners are people who identify as women. My experience was that after getting out of the mold, I ended up on vacation in Austria. It was beautiful. I was having a wonderful time with my husband at the time. All of a sudden, stabbing pain in my abdomen. We raced down the mountain to a hospital where they did emergency surgery and found that I had really bad endometriosis.
Oh my goodness.
My endometriosis continues to advance, even after 2 surgeries, after being out of the mold for years and years. Can you talk to us about what happens to your hormones when you are exposed to mold? And just for me personally, and I apologize to our listeners if they're not interested, but is there anything that we can do to kind of like get those hormones back on track, even with the onset of perimenopause and all of these kinds of things?
Yes. So I want to answer that question, but I just learned something new about you. We have that in common, the endometriosis.
Oh. Okay.
You will see all the time after someone has lived in toxic indoor mold. By the way, I have endometriosis. Mold is very estrogenic, and endometriosis can have multiple root issues. And so for me, both my grandmothers, this is so odd, maternal and paternal, both stage 4 endo in their 30s requiring hysterectomy. So I have a genetic, I know it's so not good luck, right? But anyways,
Thank God you had your kids already, though.
I had my kids. I was very lucky. I did not struggle to conceive either of my 2 children. And I didn't know about this until after childbirth, but I had, honestly, most of my life, horrible, debilitating periods, a flow of more than a tampon an hour, dark, thick, clotted. I mean, since high school. I tried birth control in college because that was, my frame of reference is all I knew.
Yeah.
Here's the birth control, and it helped until I got off of it. And then it's just,
it was a mess.
Yep. Downstream symptom whack-a-mole. And I was having hemiplegic migraines from the birth control. They said, no, too high stroke risk. You can't take this. So when I went to my doctors, they're like, all we can do is surgery. And at the time, I kind of regret, should I have done it? Should I have not have done it at the time? Because truly to be diagnosed, right, you have to have surgery to diagnose.
Laparoscopic surgery.
Laparoscopic surgery, because they have to visually see it. It's hard to see on imaging. So technically, I don't have a formal diagnosis of endo. I have a presumptive diagnosis of endo based off all my symptoms, history, and that needed to be confirmed with surgery. But what was I living in? I was living in mold. I did not yet know that at the time, but I started doing efforts to support metabolic detoxification. I kept researching. There's a huge correlation between toxin bioaccumulation and women's reproductive issues.
Yep.
Heavy metals, mold, BPAs, parasites, so many things accumulate in reproductive tissue. And that's not well discussed in Western medicine, but that's huge and very prevalently discussed in functional integrative care. And so I did a 6-month-long protocol on myself, and I got so much better. And to this day, my periods are normal flow, red, not debilitating, not needing pain medication. Now, I might not have stage 4 endo, and we're not even 100% sure that I have endo, but that's what the doctors were labeling me with. And so I know I'm getting long-winded and I want to answer your initial question, but I had this huge hypothesis that there's a big correlation between toxin exposure and endometriosis.
Yes.
And excision surgery and ablation are great. I'm not saying that there's never a time and place for surgical interventions because I'm integrative. I do believe there's a time and place for Western care, but is the root issue there that's causing it to continue to grow and the inflammation in the body?
I don't know.
And so that is, I think, at the core, a lot of women's female health problems, uterine fibroids, endo, whatever it is, that there's something driving a lot of that. And so surgery can be excellent, especially if it's deep infiltrating, it's growing around all sorts of organs. Like this could be life-threatening. Yes, you might need the surgery, but it's worth looking into.
Yes.
Is there something modifiable here that I can change? I can't change my genetics, but I can look into removing barriers to health like mold and metals and things like that. Right. So to your initial question, sorry, a little side tangent. Hormones.
That's okay. Thank you for telling all of us that, because I work with so many women who have endo, and I think this will be helpful to them to hear all of that. And I'm not a health practitioner in any way, but I would bet you $1 million it has to do with mold and biotoxins. Just saying.
Yeah. It's a really good hypothesis and one that has a lot of validity behind it. So how does mold start to wreak havoc on our hormones? So when you're exposed to mold, especially when you have this gene that we're talking about, right, it starts to suppress your MSH hormone. And when your MSH hormone starts to be suppressed, one thing that can show up from that is decreased sex hormone production. The body is like, heck no, we're being poisoned. I don't want to make a baby right now. This is not safe. And so see that in the form of very, very low progesterone. So I want to kind of put this off into 2 parts. So we're talking about reproductive years and menopausal years when it comes to women.
Yes.
So a menopausal woman, by default and part of the lifespan, right, will have downregulated progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. That's somewhat part of the lifespan and ultimately will happen. But in a woman who is still menstruating, you will tend to see very low progesterone, very low testosterone. They're oftentimes reporting, and I can relate to this, very low libido, because the body is like, that is the last thing on our mind right now. We're trying to survive right here. You'll see very low progesterone. Sometimes you'll see periods go away. Sometimes the other extreme of you'll see very heavy, thick, dark clotted blood and painful periods because certain types of mold, especially black mold, and the mycotoxin that begins with a Z, it's not at the tip of my tongue, but that one, zearalenone, how you say that, is very estrogenic. And so you start to have your hormones go like this. You'll see it, estrogen dominance, which Western medicine doesn't recognize, but for all intents and purposes, it's the ratio of the estrogen going too high, the progesterone being too low, and that can show up as puffiness, weight gain. As it relates to your work, mood changes.
Major mood changes. Yes.
Mood changes can start to happen in Western medicine. While SSRIs and medications and things can be helpful, is it reacting to a bigger problem, which is mold toxicity? And a lot of times your mood is altered, not psychologically. I mean, it can be, right? I'm not saying trauma and things like that aren't real in life events, but is there a physiological component?
Yes.
Like a biotoxin or a mold exposure that is suppressing your MSH, which in turn then is altering your hormone production.
Yes.
And then in turn is showing up as, I'm mad, I'm irritable, I don't feel good, I'm tired, I'm puffy, I'm bloated. You go to Western medicine, and obviously I'm like overgeneralizing and stereotyping here, but your labs are normal, everything's fine.
I know, I've heard that so many times in my life. Like, get over it, guys. Clearly not normal. Yeah.
Yep, because there aren't yet standards of care written yet, even though there is mounting research over here in the CIRS world. In our lifetime, we see some standards of care written, and this starts to trickle down into medical school, because I don't think it's out of malice. It's just out of everything is so legal focused, right? Hands are tied, and there's not yet really a standard of care. And doctors, understandably so, will very much like follow what the standard of care says, because they don't want to be sued in a court of law. But to the detriment of our patients falling through the cracks of, well, the Western medicine standards of care say you're fine. So oftentimes it takes accessing a functional or integrative practitioner who will honor and look at other studies that are outside of the narrative. And we'll start to, let's dive deeper and see if we can find things that are causing the disarray in the first place and the dysfunction. One other thing I'll say on that is, and what really opened my eyes when I started to become very functional and integrative aligned, because I used to be way over here. I used to be very, very Western, like 15 years ago. Thought all of this was crack until it became super personal. Just because you don't meet an ICD-10 code does not mean there is not dysfunction in your body. Traditional healthcare only knows how to, I shouldn't say only, again,
barely knows how to.
Yes, barely knows how to. You can diagnose. And it's the game of name it and tame it. Here's the ICD-10 code, it's met. Here's the pharmaceutical for that. When there can be degrees of dysfunction over here, you're not yet sick enough for me to label the downstream problem and react to it with a medication or surgery. So they don't know what to do, because it's not that they're not smart, it's that their training doesn't tell them that. And so integrative and functional people tend to look over here and say, well, let's honor the degrees of dysfunction. You don't have to be bleeding out, dying for us to do something. We should start to be reacting to these check engine lights going off before the car's on fire. Let's look under the hood and let's see what's going on. So sorry, I'm getting all passionate about it, but
I love it. Please.
I think we should lift up the hood and do a deeper dive before the car is on fire. Call me crazy.
I agree. Especially since it's like the propagation of the human species. I mean, no big deal here, but if we're all being exposed to mold, nobody can get pregnant without IVF, and the government's about to outlaw IVF. I don't know. Maybe we should check our hormones. Maybe we should all do a little Dutch test, something like that. Crazy idea, but hey.
Yeah. And what's so funny too, because I don't know if you've seen all this stuff with insurances starting to deny things, like the whole Anthem starting to deny anesthesia, or they're not paying for, like, oh my gosh, ridiculous. I go off on that. But they're willing to pay, for open heart surgery, but we don't want to pay, like you said, for a Dutch test or a GI map or all these other functional tests that I specialize in, which are not horribly expensive. I know cost is relative. We're talking a few $100s, but sometimes it gives you some answers into the dysfunction that's going on. And while that might have an investment price up front, what is that going to do for you in terms of the long term? Now I have my health back again. Now I'm not miserably bloated or puffy or swollen or whatever, that causes. And then same with finding mold, like, it's oftentimes there's a cost associated with mold if we're looking at some of the functional tests, but blood work, all my CIRS tests were covered 100%. So some of the stuff doesn't have an out-of-pocket expense to start to dig into and look at. It's just, do you have a provider who's willing to order it? Can they get it run through insurance or not? But I think the point I'm trying to make here is, if you're struggling, in my opinion, and obviously, I can't make personal financial decisions for people, but sometimes that little bit of investment can pay you out leaps and bounds of getting to the root of it, feeling better, and now you're not wasting money on copays and specialists and medications that are just suppressing symptoms. You're actually figuring it out, which yes, costs some money, but how much are you spending on all your medications every single month? How much are you spending and calling off from work because you feel like crap? How much are you, all of those other costs financially, psychologically, emotionally? So I think sometimes it's worth it to let's rip off the Band-Aid here. Let's dive deep. Let's figure out what's going on. Because most of the times there is something there. It's not idiopathic. It's not genetic. It is lifestyle. It's environment. We can fix it. And that's the silver lining in it, is you can get better.
Katie, you are such an inspiration to us. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm so relieved that we get to talk to you again next week. I want to hear so much more about hormones. I want to talk more about GI map tests and Dutch tests and all of these different things. You are a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Everybody, oh, good. I'm so glad. Everybody, we get to have Katie back again. So please send in your questions and we will see you next week.